So he goes on CNN, and RFK Jr. makes the case, or he said he could make the case, that Joe Biden is a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump. And I think this is really interesting because you and I, before we were recording, were talking about how sometimes you want to kind of check out what other people are saying and thinking that you don't agree with to kind of just gauge the temperature. I remember a couple weeks or months back, I was surprised that Democrats didn't lead more in terms of a threat to democracy, in terms of some of these polling. Hey, who do you trust more? Republicans, Democrats, economy, blah, blah, blah. Democracy. And I thought, well, democracy should be one for the Democrat column. And it was a very small win for Joe Biden, like 2 points. And I think this shows that while people on the left are saying Donald Trump tried to overturn the 2020 election, January 6th, he doesn't deserve to be on the ballot. On the other side, there are these folks that are saying, and this is what RFK Jr. was trying to make the case for, that Biden trying to censor free speech and using big tech and all that, they're basically saying it's kind of the same. And from the other side, that's their argument, and I think that's how you look at it and you go, okay, well maybe Donald Trump trying to overturn the 2020 election is not as big of a deal as people on the left think, because people on the right are basically saying, no, it kind of cancels each other out with the way Joe Biden is going after free speech. What do you think about that? I don't think it's exactly the same, but I understand what they're trying to do.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think it's a ridiculous argument, but I think it is effective. And that
Yeah.
is what matters in elections. And it has been effective at muddying the waters, right? And that's what all you need to do. And RFK Jr., as a quote unquote independent, pouring fuel on the fire of that by in that CNN interview saying what I think is a fairly provocative statement that Biden is more of a threat to democracy than Trump. That just shows you how that argument has taken hold. And it shows you kind of why RFK Jr. is such an interesting candidate, because that is a Trump message. And even though he comes from obviously a very liberal background, his father was Bobby Kennedy Sr., his dad was JFK, or his uncle, I should say. He's been a Democrat. He wanted to run in the Democratic primary, and he's been an environmental lawyer. That's why he is so interesting as a political figure, because he has those qualities and traits and backgrounds, but then he also says shit like this, and you're like, wait a minute. The vaccine stuff, the anti-vax stuff, he has appeal to both sides. But in terms of the merits of the argument, I mean, look, I am not a huge fan of censorship in any way. I'm very pro free speech. I don't like the idea of the government pressuring anybody to say anything, okay? Social media companies or anybody else. It's not the same thing. And there's a couple of Supreme Court cases where states have challenged these kinds of things, and it's been before the Supreme Court. The arguments happened last month. The cases will be decided in June. If you follow the arguments, I think it's pretty clear the Supreme Court is going to side with the federal government, even this conservative Supreme Court, because what these states challenged was the agencies of the federal government going to social media companies, mainly around COVID, but also around election stuff, and being like, look, I think this violates your policy because this person is saying this about vaccines or what the case may be. I think you should look into this. And if you if you look at what happened, in some instances, the social media companies did take things down. In some instances, they didn't. But the government came in, agencies of the government, individuals in the government, and pointed some of these things out. Now, you may agree or disagree on whether you think that's a good idea. Remember, we were in the middle of a pandemic that was ended up killing 1 million people, okay? So there's an argument of, if people are spreading information that isn't accurate about, say, a vaccine, is there any role for any government official ever not to force a social media company to censor it, but to come on and say, hey, I think this is violating your own policies. Look into this. That, I think, is a totally legitimate debate to have. How far in a national emergency like that the government should go, or agents of the government, to try to point out to companies that their speech codes are being broken. That's different than trying to overturn an election. They're not the same things. They're not even close to the same things. say what you will about Joe Biden, the idea that he is a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump, the man who spent months doing everything he could to try to overturn the results of an election where there was no evidence then or now of any fraud, is just, I know we're in this era where we all have to try to compare everything to everything else and say everything's the same. It's an absurd argument. And it's one of those things where I look at RFK because I like some of the things RFK Jr. says. I have to admit, I watched that interview with Aaron Burnett the other night on CNN. I'm one of these, I listen to podcasts, but I also get my news from traditional media. As you pointed out last week, RFK Jr. has done a ton of podcasts, not as much traditional media. So this might have been one of the few instances where some people had seen him, and he says a lot of things that I like. And I'm like, I love that you're talking about it. I love that you're bringing up things like the big ag and food and the power of the pharmaceutical industry and the agriculture industry and how that's affecting us. Who else is talking about those things? So I like that. But then he says crazy shit like this, and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, and look, I think you and I are on the same page with this, but this is where I'm trying to process how the rest of the country isn't. And I understand we're very tribal. Now, I think when it comes to free speech, don't get me wrong, and the censorship, we made a lot of mistakes during COVID, 100%. I think when we're talking about politics, folks are thinking more about the Hunter Biden laptop when they're talking about free speech and whatnot. And again, I think you use the perfect word, which is muddy. To me, it's not the same, but you can muddy the waters enough where somebody's like, yeah, they kind of all do it. It's the same thing folks are
Right. It's
saying
the
with the
same thing.
documents. It's clearly not the same if you really look into the documents. Everybody does it, you know? And so at its core, look at it like this. If we're really talking about a threat to democracy, obviously Donald Trump ended up leaving the White House, but he did prevent the peaceful transfer of power from president to president for the first time in whatever, how many years, 240 or so years of American history. Joe Biden is not going to do something like that. Now, if it's a close election, will Joe Biden go to court? Sure. I don't think Joe Biden's going to hold a rally on January 6th for his supporters. So he's not going to do any of those things. And he's very old and all that. I get it. The censorship was bad. I don't agree with it in any way, shape, or form, but I don't think it's the same either. And when we're talking about threat to democracy, if Joe Biden loses, he might be pissed, but I bet you he attends the inauguration. He might even write that famous letter that they put in the little drawer of the
Right.
Resolute desk, right? He may even do that. That's all I'm saying.
And I think there are different levels of threats to democracy, right? So if you want to say that censorship of social media by the government is a threat to democracy, I will totally buy that. If you want to just say that in general, I'll buy it. If you want to
That's
say
what I'm
that
saying.
was
Yeah.
what was done with Hunter Biden in the 2020 election is a threat to democracy, I will buy that. That is not the same thing as saying it is an equal to or greater threat than what
Yeah.
Donald Trump tried to do. It's apples and mufflers. And I think what even the Hunter Biden thing, and I want to be clear, I don't want the FBI calling up social media companies and spending their time trying to censor things. I don't want that. I think on COVID, there were some things that were legitimate misinformation that were very harmful, like things about the vaccine that were just completely made up lies, even though this vaccine was saving and did save millions of people's lives. There were other things that were labeled as disinformation that were not. The origin of the lab, of it coming from a lab, which now probably most people I think is more likely than not to be true, that was once disinformation. That certainly should never have been labeled as disinformation. We should have been able to have more open and honest exchanges about those kinds of things. But getting back to your point about the Hunter Biden thing, even with that, and again, I want to be clear, I don't think the Hunter Biden story should have been suppressed in any way. The Hunter Biden laptop. It was from what I understand. And I'll have to go back and check, but I think I'm right on this. Basically, what in Twitter, what Facebook and Instagram did, or Facebook and Twitter at that time, is they didn't allow you to share the story for a period of time. The story was still there. You just couldn't share it for a period of time, days or a week, and then you were able to after that. If you remember, that Hunter Biden laptop story had a background. It didn't come out of the ether. We know that Russia tried to interfere in our election in 2016. That's been well documented. We know that they, in the 2020 election, Russian leaked hacked emails from the DNC that cast Hillary Clinton in a negative light. We know that Donald Trump publicly said during the 2020 campaign, if you're listening, Russia, hack the emails or get me, he literally, I'm paraphrasing, but he literally said that publicly. Now, that
But
doesn't mean
wasn't he
there was
kind of
collusion.
joking though
Yes, he was.
for
That
that one?
doesn't mean right. There, I
Yeah,
think he was joking. It's with Trump, it's hard to tell. I
yeah.
want to be clear. That does not mean there was collusion between Trump and Russia in 2020. There was not. But given all that background, then you see in October this laptop that, by the way, another point of fact, Rudy Giuliani, who had possession of the laptop, would not share its contents, the hard drive, with media organizations that asked, and they did ask. The New
Mhm.
York Post story came out, and other media organizations were like, yes, let's take a look at that. Let's try to verify that. Let's see if it's true. He didn't let them do that. And as a result, you had this story that looked weird. And as a result of that happening so close to the election, social media companies were like, I don't know what to do with this. So again, am I saying it was right? No. What I'm saying is, with all of these things, there is context. And if you don't look at the context and you just kind of, oh, Hunter Biden's laptop was suppressed, that's the same thing as trying to overturn an election. If you just look at it from that kind of base level that Trump likes to play at, you can see how that narrative may have taken hold. But if you go just like a little bit deeper, they are not remotely the same. They just aren't.
And yeah, so this started with the RFK Jr. interview, which if you watch it, now I didn't watch the whole interview. I just saw the clip. Remember though, this man is a lawyer. And I remember back in the day, obviously this is not to the same level, but I remember doing mock trial back in the day, right? In like elementary school and in junior high. And you'd go in there and you'd kind of have to pick which side of the argument that you'd be on, right? Like, so this was for lawyers. It's not so much what you believe, but hey, I'm gonna be on the defense side. I'm gonna be on the prosecution. How would I go about my case? So Bobby Kennedy Jr. is a lawyer. If you listen to what he said, and I'll go back and listen again, but I'm pretty sure he said I could make the case or I could make the argument that Joe
Yes.
Biden is a greater threat. I don't think he actually believed it as I'm watching that, but he
Right.
did it almost in lawyer speak, like I could make the case, and he's a damn good lawyer.
He is. The thing about RFK Jr., there's a lot of things about him. And you're right. He did preface it that way. And I think he did that intentionally
Mhm.
because in his heart, like if you hooked him up to a lie detector, okay, and you said, who do you think is a bigger threat to democracy, Biden or Trump? I would be shocked if he said Trump and he was telling the truth, or he said Biden and he was telling the truth. Like in his heart of hearts, I think he knows. But you're right. He prefaced it because he's a smart guy. And that's the thing that about RFK Jr. is he is very smart and he is very articulate and he is very knowledgeable. And when you see people like that who are smart, who come off well, who are polished, who are clearly very knowledgeable of what they're talking about, and they speak with passion, which he does, we kind of tend to believe them, you know? So, like, he'll say some of the crazy shit he says about vaccines, and I'll listen to it and I'll be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I shouldn't get my kids vaccines. And then I'll kind of research it online and I'll be like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of evidence that, contradicts the things he says out there. But when he says it, I believe it because he's smart and he's passionate and he's articulate. And that's why I thought it was so, I don't know what the right word is, but I just thought it was so cringe. Isn't that what the kids say now? I thought it was so
Mhm.
cringe when he said Biden might be more of a threat to democracy than Trump. Like, you don't really believe that. Come on. I don't think you really believe